Hey developers, today we're going to look all about routing. Now, routing inside Vue.js is extremely important. It's how you basically get from one point of your app to the other. So we're going to take a look at the intricacies of getting up and running with routing, how to do query params, all that good stuff. So make sure you stay all the way to the end. Hey, and if you're interested in Vue.js, I actually have a link in the description below where you can get a free chapter of my book, Vue.js in Action. And I really appreciate it if you check that out. And let's have a quick word from our sponsor. I just want to take a moment and thank our sponsor, .tech Domains. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably love domain names and you love to buy ones that are short and relevant, but also most importantly, available. And that's what's really cool about .tech Domains. There's a ton of really cool domains available. And the .tech domain is broad enough that you can kind of understand that this is technology related as well. A lot of really cool sites are using .tech domains like Hollywood.tech, Viacom.tech, even personal sites like AustinEvans.tech. So if you guys are interested and you want to search for a really cool domain name, go to go.tech/Erik and then search for your domain name. If you end up buying it, you actually get up to 80% off on 1 year and 5 year domains. So go to go.tech/Erik and go ahead and pick up that domain name. Thanks. Routing is an essential part of the Vue ecosystem. In fact, it's so much that the maintainers of Vue created their own Vue router package, the official Vue router package, which you should use inside your Vue.js apps. In fact, it's an actual option that you can use when you create a new Vue app using Vue CLI. You can choose the router, and it allows us to create routes, as the name suggests. So instead of having just one page in our app, we can have multiple pages with different routes and different URLs that you can share and you can route in between. Now, as the description says, it says create a single page application with Vue plus Vue router is dead simple. And I would say for the most part that is true. However, as you get into more advanced examples, let's say we are creating authentication and we want certain routes to be guarded using, as you can see, your navigation routes, guards. It becomes a little more complicated. Same thing with transitions, some data fetching stuff. Today, we're going to look at the basics of getting started with Vue router so it doesn't get too complicated up front. And then later on, we'll take a look at more complicated scenarios in week 4, week 3, and probably week 5 as well. Let's take a look at creating an app with Vue CLI. So this, if you go back to week 1, we created an app, and I showed you how to do that, and that's essentially Vue, create, and then the name of the app. So we'll call it routing example 1, for example. And now it's going to ask us to select our features. Don't worry about this ASD. That's just a default that I had left in there from a while back. I do manually select features, and one of the options right away is router. So it is kind of essential, and it's there right off the bat to select. So you could just hit the space bar on router, and that selects it. And it's going to ask you a few things. So use history mode for router. Requires proper server setup for index fallback and production. So history mode is a way to create your routes in such a way that when your engine, your web server tries to bring up a page, that it knows where to go correctly. I would just default it to yes. There was a time where you would have history mode turned off and you would use these hashtags in your routes. I'm not going to get into that, so we'll just leave it as the default for yes. And I always use prettier here. And then it's going to ask me for some pick additional lint features, but I'm just going to leave it on the default there. And essentially at this time, it'll go ahead and install everything. And say I can put no here. And I'm going to go and Control-C it. But this will go ahead and create the routing example 1 app for us with the router already built in. Let's take a look at what that looks like. See, I already went ahead and created a routing example app. Or excuse me, a routing app. And I'll show you guys what it looks like here. So if I go into this is the routing app. And this is right out of the box. This is what you get. You get a folder called router. And inside router, you have your index. And this file is where you define your routes. And you can see here, if you go to the app.vue file, things look a little different than it did when you didn't have the router installed. We have this new router link, which is a way to link to different routes in your app. And then we have a router view, which is essentially the entry point in for which the router will display. And by default, it's in the app.view. So what that means is if we click on home here, it would link to the home route, and that would display right here where you have router-view. And the same thing with about, and it would display in the router-view there too. So you can also see it looks a little different now that we have these views. So before we just had a components folder, and then we had our app view, and that was it. Now we have a views folder. So this is by convention. You can do it this way. You can certainly change it. But what you would do is every time you create a new page inside your Vue app, you would create a new file in the views folder. So if you have a route called about, you would create an about file. If you had a route called home, you create an about home file. And then if you have each one of these pages would also have individual components inside of it. So you could have a home route like this one that now links to uses a hello world component. So you can think of each page as a view and each component as building blocks inside that page. But it's also worth mentioning these are just essentially components too, but we just call them views to keep it separated between the pages that are displayed and then actual kind of like the building blocks of each page. So home is like your index file. And that's how it's done in the app. So no longer in the app file are you importing hello world and displaying it in here. So let's take a look at what it looks like. So when you get it, it looks like this. It kind of looks like the default page, except now you have a home link at the top and an about link. So this is what it looks like. Let's create a couple of our own routes and see how that would work. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it profile.view. And let's say this was a profile of some information. So once again, I'm going to use v-based CSS. And I'm just do h3 tag here, call it my profile. And I'm going to go back into the home component. I don't really like everything here, so I'm not going to have the hello world imported in. And I'm going to delete this hello world here because I don't like it. And I'm going to save it. And of course, it gives us an error that hello world is not defined. The component's been registered but not used because I have it right here. Okay, now I have basically an empty app, except I still have the router, the two links at the top for home and about. Well, let's say I wanted to add my profile to those links. So I go back to the app view here. I'm going to copy and paste one of the router links. Now this to here defines how you want, what route you want to go to. So the simplest way is you just have about here. So I can just change it. Maybe I want this to be profile. And I'll call this profile. And I'll call this profile. And if I just save it like this, now I have an about, which I guess I could add in a bar to make it look a little nicer. I have a profile, but if I click on it, there's nothing there. And in fact, if I go into the console, I don't get an error, but there's nothing there. And it's not displaying my profile because I never added it to the router file. So I have to go to routes. And let's take a look at the basic way of creating a route. That's where you put a path, a name, and a component. So I can copy and paste this. And I will copy it. I'll paste it. Make sure I have it correct here. And now I can put a route. So I'm going to put profile. I'm going to call it profile. And now I need to actually put the name of the component here. So I'm going to call it, we'll call it profile here, but we'll need to import it in. And so we just import it in, profile. And this is called profile here. So let's see what happens when we do that. If we click profile, now we see my profile. So it's actually loading as we expected. About, we see about. Home, we don't see anything, but we can change that. If we go to the home view, I could just make some text here that says home view. So at least we see something. Okay, so we got the home view. So for some reason our home view is not working. Let me make sure I save it. There we go. Now we see a home view, this about page, my profile. So now we've created our first really simple route in the router file. Now we can do a couple of different ways too when we're routing. We don't have to, when we're routing, we don't have to just put in the name and the actual route. We can use the name. So let me show you guys that. So if I go back to app view, instead of putting route here, I can put a colon, and remember that's the same thing as vbind. And then I can put these curly brackets, and I can define where I want to go. Maybe I want to go to name. And if we go to our router, again, we know we have different names. We have one called profile. So if, let's say if I put name profile here, and I have to put that in single quotes. Let's see what happens there. Will it work? So I hit about, it goes about. If I hit profile, yep, still works. So now instead of actually putting the location of the URL, I just have the name. Let's say I wanted to, instead of just going to the name, I wanted to actually send a parameter over. Well, you can do that too. So let's go back to routes. And let's create a new profile route, but this time we want to pass in let's pass in a parameter. Now, when I talk about parameters, that means we can have more than just profile here. We could basically have dynamic routes. And the way the dynamic routes work is you put in a colon. So I could do /profile :ID. And what that says is that it's looking for an ID, a dynamic route with an ID that's being passed to it. Okay, if I save it, well, let's do one other thing. If we go into profile, we can actually look at the routes that are being sent to it. So if I can go H4, I can actually look at the parameters that are being sent to it. So to do that, I do $route, and this is like a reserved keyword inside Vue.js that it knows about. .route.params, and then I called it ID. So if I click here and refresh it, I don't see anything. But if I put in, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can see, or 1, 2, 3, this route is now showing up. And by the way, it says duplicate name routes defined, profile, path profile. Missing params for need a route, expected ID to be defined. So it's giving us some errors because we haven't quite set everything up correctly. Because we have two profiles and they think they're duplicated. So I'm going to delete this one. And now I don't have any errors. Now if I go to the route without it, it still works fine. But now it mentions that, so it says we have expected ID to be defined. So we could send an ID over. If we go back to the app view here, we can send a params, which I believe is params. And then it's an object as well. And then we can send ID, and I can send, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's see what happens when we do that. So now refresh it, home view, about view. And now it goes to profile /1, 2, 3, 4, and we don't get any errors anymore. So about, here's the profile 1, 2, 3, 4. Cool. So now we were able to send parameters over inside this params block right here. And now we have also defined the params inside here. Well, by the way, if you wanted to, we can also, let's say in the mounted hook, we just wanted to print out the params. We can do console log this.route.params ID, and then this would also print it out in the console. So now we can see here about profile, it prints it out in the console, this 1, 2, 3, 4. What happens if we wanted to watch when this route changes? So I mentioned earlier that that one thing you can do is you can watch for changes, and one common way of using watch is to use it with the route. So let's see this. If we can do watch here, we can do watch here, we do route, and then to, and then from, and then we can do something with it. So we can console log to, And let's console log from. So if we refresh it, we have about the route. So what happened right now is that we don't have this being triggered because the route is kind of logging it. As soon as you go to the profile, it's not changing. But let's say we had a router link that went to a different profile. So let's add a router link. Let's add a router link, but let's say we wanted to go and we wanted to send it to the same route, the same parameters route, but with a different, the same profile route, but with different parameters. So in that case, we can do name, we can do profile again, we can do params, and this time we want to send it to 456. Let's do 456 like this. So it does gave us an error, parsing an unexpected expression. Oh, I forgot to put quotes over these. There we go. And now we probably want to put a link, another route. So now we have this button that says another route. So if I click another route, now this to and from gets sent, because essentially it doesn't reload when you're in profile 123 and you go to profile 456, the query the parameters for 456, it doesn't reload the component. However, if you want to look at what happened, you can add a watch to it, and now I could see that we went from 123 to 456, and I could see the to and the from it. So I can I can track it and do different things. So maybe I needed to go hit the database again when someone clicked 456 to grab the latest information. Because the component doesn't reload, I can use this watch and then reload the information from the back end for it. So that's essentially what that does. Another really common scenario is using a 404 page. So in this one, if I put to a route like, I don't know, ASDF, nothing happens. But let's create a 404 route. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it 404.vue. Once again, I'm going to use my quick template here, and I'm just going to call this 404 route. And now I want to make sure that if none of these match, then it will go into the 404 route. So I usually put this at the bottom, and I'll put parentheses here. I'm going to put path, and I'm going to do star, which will match everything. And then I can put in component, and I'm going to put in component 404, which I'm going to call 404. And I'm going to import it in here from 404.vue. Now it doesn't like, this is a problem that I called it 404. It doesn't like the name 404. So I'll just call it missing. Might be easier. Missing. And then I'll call this missing. And then I'll call this missing. And so it still has another error. Missing is defined but never used. So I need to get rid of the quotes. And now it can't resolve the 404 because it's not there. Let me make sure I don't have it anywhere. Oops, this should be missing. Missing.vue. Okay, I think I got rid of all the errors. Cool, now I have a 404 route. So you can see here, I go to the main route, get home view, about, profile, but if I put in something that doesn't make any sense, it goes to the 404 route. So that's one way of catching 404 errors. Okay, let's go back to our original example where we had this profile, and we wanted to have not just one with parameters, but without parameters. And I kind of skipped over that. So if you save it here, and I have a route that says profile that doesn't have an ID, then you get this error that you have duplicate route names. You can easily fix that by just changing this name. I can call this profile main if I wanted to. I do profile main, refresh, then let's see here. It does say a duplicate route definitions, but just didn't save. There we go. So now I don't get any errors, and I could potentially have different routes based on if it's the main profile or if it has a parameter as well. Another thing we could probably take a look at is in this profile here, I have params, but you can also send query params too. So query params are just like the other params, except they are usually have a question mark and equal. So to do that, you just put a comma here, query, and then you just put in whatever you want. So I can make, I don't know, plan private. If I save it here, and I go to profile, you don't see it here. Oops, actually, since this is the router link inside profile, I added it to this query. If I click here, this another route, now I can see the plan right here. So this has plan private. And you can see here in the top right hand corner, we have a question mark, plan equals private. So that's how you do query params. And you can use those to pull information or put information to different routes and then display information based on that. One last thing I want to show you guys for the basics of routing is we have this dynamic. We'll talk about that in our next video. But we can actually do child components of it, or nested routes. So we have a normal route here with a component, but what happens if we wanted a child route? So we just do children here. And now we can actually, yep, that's right. And then each child is its own component. So we can have path equals info. And now we can have a component called, like, I don't know, info. So let's create a new view. I'm going to create a new view here. That's called info.view. And I'll use my V-based CSS. And I'll have right here information. So this could be interesting. Maybe you have a profile that has an ID. And then if you have inside the profile, you can get even more detail by clicking the person's, I don't know, name, and then it goes into an info route. So essentially the URL would be something like this. It would be profile, and then an ID, maybe 12, and then info. And this would be the route for this one, for this child right here. So it would be more like right here. So now we need to add an info. So once again, I'm going to create one real quickly. Info, delete info. And now we have this info route. So let's add a router link to it in our profile. We already have router to this other query. But let's say we wanted to, and we went back to the router, we called it info. And you can give this a name too, but we're not going to. So we'll call it, to route to it, we can call it name, and then, well, let's do this. Let's give it a name. If we give it a name, we call it info. So now it has a name of info. And if we want to route to it, we can go here, info, and we would have to give it some parameters. So we give it a params here. We'll give it ID of 3. Let's see what happens if we use that. So we have another route here. And now you can see here it went to profile 3 info. So let me make sure you can see that correctly. Just a simple break. Okay, and we'll call this info route. So now we have an info route, and here's another route. Here's the main route, which is /1234. Info route goes to /3/info, and this has the info information. Now to get this working, we actually have to, we can set the router like this. We can do /profile /35/info, and to actually get it working, we have to add the router view. So if I add the router view into profile here, and refresh it, now it seems to work. We have a profile here. We hit info route. Now we display the information in that route. So since it has a child component, we have to add the router view for it to work. So that's a lot of information. Look it over. Let me know what you think. Thanks.